If an investor sells a rental property and makes a big profit, is there really a way to avoid paying tax on that gain right now?
Legally, yes, if you follow a very specific process. It's called a 1031 exchange, and it's one of the most powerful tools real estate investors have for building a portfolio, and one of the most commonly misunderstood.
Why does this matter right now?
It matters right now because a lot of investors who bought 5, 10 years ago are sitting on massive unrealized gains. And the fear of a huge tax bill is actually keeping some of them from selling and moving into a better performing property. A 1031 exchange removes that barrier. It lets you defer the gain and keep that capital working, instead of handing a third of it to the IRS and starting over with less. It's also a portfolio scaling tool, not just a tax tool. I see investors use it to trade one property that's become a management headache for 2 or 3 smaller ones, or to consolidate 3 scattered properties into one larger asset that's easier to manage. The tax deferral is the mechanism. The strategy is upgrading your portfolio without a tax event getting in the way.
What do people get wrong about how this works?
Yeah, one thing they get wrong is they think it means avoiding taxes entirely, or that you can just sell a property and buy whatever you want a year later and call it an exchange. Neither is true. It's deferral, not elimination. The tax liability rolls into the new property and becomes due eventually, usually when you finally sell without exchanging again. And the timeline is strict and unforgiving. Not sometime this year, but 45 days to identify a replacement property and 180 days total to close on it, starting the day the first property sells. The other misconception is around boot. Any cash or debt reduction you pocket out of the exchange that isn't reinvested. If you sell for $600,000 and roll $550,000 into the replacement property, that $50,000 difference is boot and it's taxable immediately, even though the rest of the exchange is deferred. A lot of investors don't realize a partial exchange still triggers a partial tax bill.
Walk through how it actually works.
Well, there's 4 requirements, and missing any one of them disqualifies the exchange. 1, the property has to be held for investment or business use. A primary residence does not qualify. A property you genuinely rented out does. There's no official IRS minimum holding period for a standard exchange, but most advisors recommend holding at least 2 years to clearly demonstrate investment intent. If you're exchanging with a related party, though, a 2-year hold is an actual legal requirement, not just a guideline. 2, the replacement property has to be like-kind, which is broader than most people assume. A rental duplex can't exchange into a commercial building, raw land, or another rental property. It just has to be real property held for investment. 3, you can't touch the sale proceeds. The money goes to a qualified intermediary, a neutral third party who holds the funds and uses them to acquire the replacement property. If the money lands in your account, even briefly, the exchange is disqualified. And it has to be the same taxpayer on both sides. The name that sold the relinquished property has to be the same name that acquired the replacement, with narrow exceptions for certain LLCs and trust structures your CPA or attorney would set up in advance. And 4, the 45 and 180-day clocks I mentioned, 45 days to formally identify up to 3 potential replacement properties in writing, 180 days total to close on one of them. On the financing side, if the property you're exchanging has a mortgage, taking on less debt for the replacement property could create taxable boot unless you offset the difference with additional cash. That's why I get involved early and coordinate with your CPA and qualified intermediary to structure the financing properly and avoid unexpected tax consequences.
Give me a real example.
Yeah, I had an investor that owned a duplex for about 12 years. Original purchase price around $310,000. It appreciated to roughly $620,000. Selling outright would have meant capital gains tax on nearly $310,000 in profit, a number large enough that he'd be sitting on the property for 2 extra years just to avoid facing it. We structured a 1031 exchange. He engaged a qualified intermediary before the duplex ever hit the market, so the moment it sold, proceeds went straight to the intermediary, never touched his account. Within the 45-day window, he identified a small multi-family property, an 8-unit building, as the replacement, along with 2 backup candidates in case financing on the first fell through. We financed the new purchase with a DSCR loan sized to match and exceed his prior mortgage balance, which kept the exchange clean and avoided any taxable boot. The whole transaction from sale to purchase closed within 140 days, comfortably inside the 180-day window. He deferred the entire gain, moved from a 2-unit property into an 8-unit property, and increased his monthly cash flow by roughly $2,100 a month. None of that capital went to a tax bill. All of it went to work.
What should investors know that isn't obvious?
The 45 identification window is the part that catches most people off guard. It sounds like a lot of time until you're actually in it. You have to have a target property or up to 3 candidates in writing within 45 days of closing on the sale. Investors who start looking for a replacement property after they sell are usually behind. The smart approach is to have the qualified intermediary lined up and be actively shopping before the current property even closes. The other nuance, this only works for investment property. If you lived in the property at any point, or it's a second home you use personally more than a certain number of days a year, it likely doesn't qualify. There's a narrow path where a property that started as a rental and was later converted to a primary residence can carry some exchange benefit under specific IRS rules, but that's a CPA conversation, not something to assume applies to you. And financing on the property needs to be lined up in parallel with the identification period, not after you've already picked a property. If a lender can't close within your 180-day window, the exchange fails regardless of how good the property is. The costliest mistake is waiting until after closing to think about the exchange. The qualified intermediary needs to be in place and the exchange agreement signed before the sale closes, not after. I've had investors call me the week after they sold wanting to do a 1031 exchange. At that point, it's too late. The opportunity to defer that gain is gone the moment the sale proceeds land in their account. If you're thinking about selling an investment property, 3 things before you list it. 1, talk to your CPA about what your actual gain and tax exposure would be if you sold outright. Number 2, if a 1031 exchange makes sense, get a qualified intermediary lined up before you accept an offer. And 3, call me early so we can talk through what the replacement property's financing needs to look like to keep the exchange clean. Reach out before you list, not after you closed. And you can text me at 720-248-6892 or take the investor path on the home loan quiz at teamaronheim.com.